Great. Well, welcome everyone to our panel, Equity at Scale, Expanding Access to Cell and Gene Therapies Across Borders. My name is Tim Hunt, and I'm the CEO at the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. I'm delighted to be here today with this august group to talk about this important topic. And maybe just, we're going to spend a few minutes on context up and down the panel, but context on why we think this is important at ARM. So in January of 2024, we kicked off a project that we call Cell and Gene Therapy Ethics and Society. And it was a lot around, there are a lot of questions that people have that are very legitimate around our technology, like, while cell and gene therapies can be expensive, do people have access to them? Will only wealthy countries have access to them? What about ultra-rare disorders? What about guardrails around some of this frontier technology like germline editing? Lots of legitimate questions that we felt like it was important to grapple with. Even if we can't solve them, with some magic wand, we thought it was important to talk about them in an effort to build trust with lots of stakeholders that we care about. People like patient organizations, physicians, scientists, policy leaders, regulators, religious leaders, and what have you. So in the spirit of that's where this panel has come from. Here we're gonna discuss expanding equitable global access to cell and gene therapies by addressing regulatory, commercial, ethical considerations across borders. And we're gonna start with a little further context setting, which is, as I mentioned yesterday in my opening remarks, we all know the capital markets have been super tricky, right? So they have not been favorable to getting real therapies out the door and approved and launched in the US and Europe, right? There are safety questions that have arisen over the years, including this year, as I discussed yesterday. There's legitimate questions about, patients embracing some of these modalities because they can have difficult treatment regimens, right? Cost of goods can be high. So there's a lot of context that we'll explore in the first question just briefly, but at the same time, we do think it's very important, and there's been that we have global access, and there have been some very notable success stories, including Zolgensma. A little preview of what's to come. But with that, I'm gonna have people introduce themselves. I'm gonna jump around the order a little bit. I'm gonna start with Jim Wilson. Maybe you give a little bit on your background, and you have some cool news just out today. Everybody's gotta listen up, just out today.
Well, thanks for having me here. Clearly an issue that's important to all of us, but particularly what we've decided to do to address access. So my name is Jim Wilson. I've been in gene therapy for 40 years, been at Penn for 35 years, and a year ago in a week, I decided to leave my endowed professorship and become a real CEO of a company. Not something I aspired to do when I was a postdoc at MIT, I can tell you that much. But the reason is that despite the fact that we were quite successful at Penn, starting 8 companies, bringing 18 products into the clinic, all for rare diseases and all gene therapy, that we eventually sort of hit the wall, which occurred over the last 5 years, in which our companies were unable to raise money to progress these assets, both clinically and also commercially. And so we asked the question with Penn leadership, what should we do about it? And is there potentially a better or a different business model that may allow us to secure the necessary capital to move this forward? We started a company called GEMMABio, rare diseases, huge portfolio of assets, pitched it for a year, mixture of ultra-orphans ready for commercialization, larger market indication products a little earlier, and could not find any investor interested in investing in that. Some like the larger market indications, and some actually, the family offices, sort of mission capital liked the ultra-orphans. So agility, I think, is important in this life, in this career, in this sector. So we decided that we would spin out the ultra-orphan indications into a separate company, and that more of a late-stage clinical and commercial company, and stick at the bread and butter of what would be more interesting to strategics and to venture capital investment, the larger market indications. And that new company we just announced this morning is called Rare Therapeutics, Inc. And so we basically have two processes. And I found that there wasn't any one investor that was in love of both. There were different kind of investors. And our hope is it'll be easier to sort of resource those programs and look forward to talking about why we think we can actually develop a business out of that. But I guess that's a topic, and provide access. Maybe we can talk about that later in the session. So thank you.
Thank you, Jim, very much. Kevin, we're going to hop over to you next.
Okay, welcome. I'm glad to be here. This is come back every year because it's such an exciting conversation that's being held. My name's Kevin FitzGerald. After my name, you'll see an SJ. That stands for the fact that I'm a Jesuit, like Pope Francis. I'm obviously a Catholic priest. But I'm also a Ph.D. in molecular genetics with a focus on cancer genetics, and a Ph.D. in bioethics. And I've been involved in several global sort of healthcare projects in India, South Korea, Germany. Had a chance to engage with a lot of different communities, including indigenous communities across the world. And so the context that I like to emphasize is interdependence. A lot of the challenges that you have in front of you are issues of scale, issues of collaboration, issues of trust in getting different groups of people together. And so I also happen to serve on a Vatican Bioethics Commission, the Pontifical Academy for Life. And obviously, Vatican's very interested in global healthcare. There are about 104 billion Catholics around the world, and we do a lot of work in the healthcare arena and trying to make sure that people have access to healthcare equitably is an enormous challenge of scale. And so I'm really glad, again, to be continuing these conversations to look for ways in which we can work together to kind of address those challenges. And again, it's not going to be perfect. We're not going to solve everything. But I think we can make significant progress if we all are in this together.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Yep. Let me jump over to Lisa, and then we'll go to Matthew.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Lisa Deschamps, CEO of a clinical stage CNS gene therapy company called AviadoBio. Prior to AviadoBio, queued up by Tim here, I was at Novartis for over 25 years. My last role there, I was leading our global neuroscience business, did the acquisition of Avexis, led the integration, and then went over to lead the worldwide commercialization of the acquired portfolio, which mainly in the short term, as many of you know, was Zolgensma. It was a luxury and a privilege to be a part of that worldwide launch amongst an amazing team that we built, and lots and lots and lots and lots of learnings, for sure. You know, when I think about the context setting, as you've queued up for us, you know, I think for all of us in the room, there's so much coming at us, right? You know, we have all the economic challenges that we all know. We have the geopolitical, the list is endless, and we can really get distracted. We have to play our role and contribute in the best ways we possibly can. But at the same time, I think our job in all of our hands is to control what we can control. And so, you know, every day I think about, okay, what can I control today? You know, how can we just put our heads down, stay focused, again, contribute to the broader topics, because that's our job as well. But, you know, really making sure that our ultimate mission that we each have, and with whatever companies we are leading and being a part of, to make sure that we can truly bring these advanced therapies into the hands of patients. And so I think about that in the context of really understanding the disease areas we're in, what the patient needs are, the journeys that the patients face, the diagnostic challenges, thinking about how do we generate data that's not only meaningful in the progression of the disease and advancing care, but also in the context of being able to enable access that it's compelling enough for the payers and the governments around the world to think that these are worthy of paying for, to ensure that we build viable commercial models. And I can tell you, it's never too soon to think about that, and there's a lot of lessons there as well. And just to make sure that we can really support the communities and the patients, and because at the end of the day, that is, as Rita said earlier this morning, patients are all of our North Star. So.
Great, thank you. Matthew, and maybe give, just for the audience, for those that may be a little less familiar with cell and gene therapy Catapult, maybe a little background for us from the United States.
Thanks, Tim. So I'm Matthew Durdy. I'm the Chief Exec of the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult. The Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult is a technology and innovation organization which was initiated by the UK government. And our mission is actually very pertinent to this discussion today. Our vision is for a thriving ATMP industry, delivering life-changing therapies to the world. And those two parts, as far as we're concerned, are fundamental to going together. If you want to have greater access, it's going to be an industrial solution to that. And that'll be a theme of what I talk about later on. The Catapult itself, we are a technology and innovation organization with teeth, is the way I like to think about it. We have 300 experts totally focused on cell and gene therapy. We have GMP facilities where we do active innovation in manufacturing processes. We have robotics and digitization teams. We have process development teams. We have a venture capital team. And we have a market access and patient access team as well. So we cover the whole gambit of what's going on. I have two bits of context, really, to put on. I was conscious of the fact that this was after lunch, so I brought an old friend with me. Those of you, some of you might remember this. This is my first mobile phone. Okay?
Somebody please get a picture of this and send it to me, because this is going up on LinkedIn.
It was given to me by my boss, and I hated it. Okay, I looked at it, I thought, that is completely useless, completely pointless. It cost $10,000. It was $1,000 a month to rent.
Wow.
And it was $10 a minute to make calls to New York. All right? That is not a solution that was going to go anywhere near Africa. All right? This is where we are today. This is where the cell and gene therapy industry is today. Okay? The developing world, in particular, has benefited from mobile telephony disproportionately to the rest of the world. So the challenge that I set is, how do we get there? The other point I was making, I've always got a plan B as well, or there is a plan B in there. Despite the fact that we're at the beginnings of the industry, the conversations are already starting about how we expand access to cell and gene therapies. But they're starting, I'm trying to move them over to an industrial solution, but they're starting in the context of the classic drug solution. So I've been involved with conversations with a very large funder of medical technologies, a very large supranational health organization, and a couple of regulators from developing world countries and also from African countries to work out how we go about trying to expand access to cell and gene therapies, and I might touch on a bit more of that later. But this is an active discussion with people who have the resources to make a difference.
Very cool. And if people from the US are not very familiar with cell and gene therapy Catapult, I would encourage you to go online, check out their website. They really are one of the jewels in our ecosystem. Okay, so on our prep call, because you do these panels, you have to have a prep call. On our prep call, we talked about what I call small e ethics a little bit. And that kind of got to trust building. I think, Lisa, you might have been the one that kind of kicked us off on, it's really this is a lot about how do you build trust with important communities to then ultimately drive global access through partnerships and things like that. And everybody here has had some great personal experiences on that. And it did remind me of a conversation I had with somebody probably a year and a half ago who was telling me, this is all about, cell and gene therapy is all about the science. It's only about the science. It's the science. It's all about the science. And I said, okay, but it reminds me of two examples. One, if it was all about the science, a lot more people would have been vaccinated for COVID than ultimately got vaccinated by COVID. And two, all of Germany would be eating GMO food, which is not the case, right? You have to build trust in communities if you want to see technology ultimately deployed equitably, I think. So Kevin, we'll start by picking on you. You've spent a little bit of time thinking about this topic in Africa and other parts of the world. Tell us more about trust building.
Yeah, so I like your GMO example because I think that it is extremely pertinent in one particular regard. And that is that as excited as we can get with progress and developments in the technology, it doesn't really matter if we aren't communicating with the people we're trying to help. we're trying to serve, we're trying to engage with. So one, of course, great example is the GMOs, and I was actually back in the early 2000s working with Pioneer and Pioneer Seed Company in Iowa, just a couple hours from Creighton in Omaha. And they were totally miffed that they had this fantastic stacking genetic technology that they were using in their corn and soy seeds, and they couldn't make any progress. You know, they weren't like Monsanto, they didn't have a terminator gene, they were doing it differently, it was so much better, and they couldn't get anywhere. And the question, they pulled together a little group, and we just asked them, with whom are you talking? Well, they're talking with farmers, because they're selling them seed. But they weren't talking with the end consumer, the people who were buying the food. So one of the things we told them was, well, you have to have these conversations, and when you do, you have to be willing to hear something you don't want to hear. You have to be willing to hear questions that you don't think are relevant. You have to be willing to hear fears and concerns that you don't think should be there. And you have to be willing to hear rejection and people saying, you know, I just don't want to do that now. But what's important is the engagement, because that's what leads down the road to the successful collaborations and that ability to build those communities of trust. So the other one example, which is also fascinating, is actually here in Arizona. Many of you may be familiar with the Havasupai tribe that are in and around the Grand Canyon. And back in the 90s, there were researchers who recognized the fact that because their diet had changed from their traditional diet to a more American diet, they were having enormous troubles with type 2 diabetes and obesity. And so the idea was, could the researchers find a way, working with the tribe, to come up with tailored kinds of interventions that would be most helpful for them? And so the tribe did agree to allow some of their biological material to be given to Arizona State University researchers so that they could take a look at that. What never came up was, what do we do in science when we have something as valuable as biological material from indigenous communities, right? You share it. You share it with your colleagues. You share it with people doing other sorts of research. And one of those other sorts of research was sort of an evolutionary genetics research project, whereby the tribe was told that you're not from here. Originally, you're from somewhere else. Well, that didn't go over very well with the religious leaders in the tribe and their particular cultural roots. And so in the end, the whole project fell apart, ended up in the courts. There was all kinds of litigation, and it was a disaster. And it didn't have to be that way. But the problems that these things come up is, we have to think, as Lisa was mentioning, yes, stay focused on what you do, but also be open to hearing those conversations where people are going to raise questions and issues which don't fit well with your focus, but will ultimately be absolutely key in you achieving the end goals that you have.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. So, Lisa, a lot of learnings, no doubt, from Zolgensma. I was thinking this morning, Zolgensma's, it's been so successful that a lot of times, I think in biotech, people look at the successes, and if they happened a few years ago, they say, it must have been easy. You know, I think of like the pioneers at Genzyme that were working on Ceridase and Cerezyme. You talk to them, they're like, it was like breaking rocks in the hot sun. Like, it's been so successful, but it wasn't always that way, and you were there on the ground, pioneering a lot of things and building trust, and maybe share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so definitely wasn't easy. And in fact, some days it was really ugly, I would say. But in the end, you know, there's nothing better than saving a child's life, right? So that always keeps you grounded. You know, trust is such an important thing, and ethics, and, you know, all the things that we talk about a lot. And really, trust comes from, you know, it's an outcome, right? It only happens if your actions, you know, ladder up to people having trust in what you're doing, and you earn that credibility over time. And so it takes a lot of effort. You know, I think about the work that we're doing at Aviado, even though we're several years still from, you know, being on the market, and even prior, you know, we just now are in our phase 1/2 trial, we hired an advocacy person 2 years ago, right? And you wouldn't normally do that in other disease areas that are outside probably rare disease or even these advanced therapies. But it's so important to work with the community and build trust. So we made that investment. It doesn't take a lot of resource. It just takes a purposeful thought about it because it's so critical. When I was at Novartis, you know, we had this, there was so much demand when we got the approval in the US, all around the world. And we were still working with EMA and Japan and other markets to work on getting the regulatory approval, not to mention the reimbursement, you know, situations, you know, that was going to take however long. And you know, the calls from parents and, you know, of their children, and it was overwhelming. And so we thought, you know, is there something we can do in the meantime? And so we were asked to see if we can launch a managed access program worldwide in the countries that we didn't have Zolgensma available. Now that was a great idea and a very generous one, something that a small biotech couldn't do, but a Novartis could do, right? And so, you know, we came up with a program where we would offer 100 doses for no charge to any family, government, et cetera, in markets where Zolgensma wasn't yet available. But the challenge for us was to think about how do we decide who gets those 100 doses, right? So something that is such an amazing opportunity can be really challenging ethically. So even prior to going public that we were going to do this, we hired a bioethics group to work with. We worked with the clinicians in the field to come up with what would be the appropriate criteria. And of course, one would think that you should stay true to where the science would have the greatest impact. So in that case, it would mean newborns, right? Because you would have a greatest magnitude of effect versus kids who maybe were already 2 years old and had already lost a lot of neurons, et cetera. But you tell that to a parent, right, whose child, you know, is dying, and it's not such an easy decision. So in the end, we decided, you know, from a criteria perspective, we would follow the U.S. label because that was something we had a very objective measure. We also, you know, we had this whole rollout planned, and we had an hour or two before we were going to issue a press release. We called up all the advocacy groups we'd been working with to tell them about this program and what the criteria was going to be, and you know how we would work with them. And it didn't go quite as we had hoped, right? So within 20 seconds of hanging up from that webinar, we did a series of 3 of them, Routers was calling. And the headlines were, you know, Novartis launching, you know, lottery for a child's life. And it was really ugly, right? And it goes back to something everyone probably remembers this, right? I can tell you it was very difficult. And I can tell you before we went live with the program and we were at the, you know, in the boardroom and I was asked, you know, is there anything else you need? I said, well, we need to hold hands because it's going to get crazy. And it did, right? Now, in hindsight, could we have brought the community in a little sooner? We thought we were working with them, but we obviously needed to do much better, right? And so we quickly had a summit. We went to Paris. We brought all the advocacy leaders, all the top clinicians that were treating SMA, families. We brought them together and we said, okay, we're open to changing the criteria. We're open to doing this differently. Help us figure out how to do it because we have walked around this. We're too close to it now. And in the end, we left that 2-day summit in the same place we were when we launched, but everybody felt better about it, right? Everybody was a part of contributing. And it just goes to show you that something that has such good intention, right? Something that was amazing for, and Novartis, I believe, ran that program for three years consecutively. And so the amount of kids that were saved and treated, you know, as a result, not all of them, of course, but, you know, the intent was there. But the execution matters, right? And the working with the community and the trust that you build or don't build initially, it was a great lesson, certainly for all of us.
What's that line? There's an old line, trust arrives on foot and leaves on horseback. Right? Like it takes forever to build it and it's gone
in seconds.
Fast.
In 20 seconds.
20
the
seconds.
headline was on Reuters. It was out. It was out.
Yeah. Jim, you've been in this now for a year, in a few days, and you've been working on this exact issue in Brazil and in the Middle East. These are not typical biotechnology markets, and you've undoubtedly learned a lot about trust building along the way. And share some ideas with us.
Sure. So when I think about access, there are two dimensions to it. One is it's not whether some countries can afford it and some countries can't, but whether drug developers will develop it. And there, I was at the investor panel, and it was what struck me about that was I believe if someone stood up a gene therapy program now, with all the science and all the opportunities, investors can find a way to fund that, and drug developers can find a way to develop that product successfully. The system works for the investors. But when you look at it through the lens of the patients, the 98% that wouldn't fit within the playbook of venture pharma, it's not working. And that is a problem. So first of all, we have to find a way to develop and manufacture our products in a much more capital efficient way. The science will help that. That thing is a great example versus mine. It'll become more affordable, and that will help. But in terms of global access, just a few facts. Per capita spend in the United States on healthcare, $13,000. UK, $7,000. Brazil, $721. India, $72. That's a reality that we're not going to change. And the burden of genetic diseases is disproportionately ex-US, significantly ex-US. So we can start by developing products that are safer, more effective, and easier to get approval in an expedited way. But there are ways in which working with health authorities is going to be an important part of that. So when we sat back and we asked the question, who's aligned with, we're going to start from scratch, we realize the playbook isn't really working with what we want to do, who is most aligned with us to bring forward cheaper, better, accessible drugs? And those are governments in which the government is a payer. That's where we had the most alignment. We were approached by the Ministry of Health in Brazil to make a better version of existing products, and they risk shared. They provided substantial non-dilutive capital, and in return, an agreement pre-negotiated on the price for the public health system. Middle East, we signed a similar deal with the Department of Health in Abu Dhabi. Different kind of agenda, but still the same sort of thing. We're in discussions with 3 other countries, 2 of which are pretty significant. What I've learned, which is the most stunning aspect of what we've done, is when you have a partnership with a government in which they're the payer, and it is a minister in which review, pricing, and reimbursement falls under that same umbrella, oh my Lord. The ways in which these conversations go, how they're facilitated, the collaboration. I won't even share this with my colleagues who've been in the trenches with these same people because they're going to think I'm on weed. Yeah. This guy's nuts. But I am telling you, if you can get that kind of alignment, it's not always this way. These governments will work in a way that makes it much easier to operate in that setting. And so I think the crux of all of this ultimately is going to be a scalable commercial model for one-and-done treatments with rare diseases. And I can tell you one thing, the diseases we work on, which it's totally unmet need, is we don't have to spend a lot on sales and marketing for market share.
Right.
Because you become the market.
Right.
That's just one example of how we just have to kind of rethink. And the problem is the incumbents, which God bless, they make drugs to help all of us, aren't incented or don't have the systems necessarily to kind of rethink this. I'll leave on one note. We were at a meeting with a rare disease nonprofit the other day. But yesterday you organized it.
Yeah.
We had 20 people in. We were talking about how we're going to work within the system. A CEO of an editing company, I won't say his name, said the only way that we're really going to succeed here is we blow it up. Now, I don't think we necessarily have to blow it up, but his point is we have to sort of rethink.
Right.
And if we're going to start from scratch, let's just rethink everything.
Right.
And whether it's going to work or not, we're going to try, and others are trying, and I'm not sure it's saying that this is a model. But I'm super excited about the collaboration, the collegiality. The more that there's been this haves and have-nots, the more this galvanizes people that otherwise may not have been so motivated to work with us. So I'm very optimistic.
Well, in a sense, you've done your own version of blowing up a model, and that you're not thinking first and foremost U.S. and then traditional markets, Germany, UK, France, Spain. This is it's a different animal. So it's what makes it so interesting, I think. Yeah. Matthew, all right, you're an expert trust builder over many years. Well, you got any other tricks up your sleeve? You got that phone I like so much.
Well, let me just bring a government out of my pocket now. Jim's already talked about government a bit, and he's obviously had a very good experience with it. But I think if we're going to talk about people we need to bring with us,
yes,
and particularly in the context of when you're trying to cover a number of jurisdictions at the same time, there's not going to be clinical trials in every single country. Right? There's not going to be a manufacturing facility located in that country. And the chances are that the regulator in that country is not really going to have a lot of room to say much about what's going to come in. There's going to need to be a lot of trust built with governments and with regional regulators as such, to make sure that when the time comes and these therapeutics are ready for rollout, that they're not standing in the way of the rollout as well. And the other point I'll just chuck in at this level is the things that we are talking about here are not unique to the rest of the world. Yeah. These are all problems that are seen. I was having a conversation this morning with a group around a round table where we were talking about the fact that uptake of gene therapies, where there isn't a short-term terminal outcome or prognosis for the patient, uptake can be restricted if the patients don't understand what's being offered to them. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. All right, well, just staying with that, you guys do a ton of important work to think about things like modern manufacturing, scale, driving down cost of goods, all of which are part of the secret sauce, I would argue, ultimately to seeing these technologies going from the giant phone to the smartphone, right? So in our world, ultimately in vivo therapies that can be deployed to African countries and to other parts of the world. And you've spent time in various parts of the world. So when you think about this generally, A, why is it important? And B, what's it going to take to deploy these things more globally?
Sure. I mean, I lived through the rollout of the next generation. This wasn't even digital. This was it was a terrible technology. But I lived through the rollout of the next stages, and I observed what happened in the telecommunications industry. And I think there are lessons there for us. Now, clearly, telecommunications is very homogeneous, and our industry is not. But there are lessons to be learned. And we can go down a level to, say, CAR-Ts, certain types of gene therapy and the like, and we can take those lessons. So the first point is, it wasn't a market solution, all right? It didn't just happen. Somebody intervened in telecommunications, point one. Point two, what did they do? They sat down as a group and they said, let's work out very clearly what we are going to compete on and what we are not going to compete on. So in the case of telecommunications, it's we're going to compete on service, quality of service, and everything else is just cost. In our field, we should be competing on the basis of patient experience, safety, and efficacy. Everything else is cost, right? So the second thing they did was say, well, let's create a framework for innovation. Let's create a framework. No, we don't want to make standards. We don't want to make standard phones or standard drugs. But we do want to create a framework in which innovation can happen very, very quickly and can be adopted very, very quickly. So you need to create that kind of framework together. And then you roll it out, and you allow innovation to happen more quickly. That brings down the cost of goods. You've got the competitive environment. That brings down the price. But I've never heard anybody say, oh, I'm feeling so sorry for the telecommunications companies because they're not making enough money, all right? the volumes went up incredibly. Prices came down, margins came down, but profitability went up enormously. And that's where we've got to get to as an industry if we are really, really going to move the dial on this. If we're really going to get these therapeutics to patients, we've got to work together to blow up the existing model and come up with a new one. And the net effect of that was you ended up with lower cost of goods, more innovation, volumes went up through the roof, and you get a virtuous circle because, of course, the volumes go up, cost of goods comes down dramatically. And I think that's where we need to be aiming.
Yep, great. Kevin, you've spent some time skulking around in Africa. You've reminded me on more than one occasion. I think the biggest healthcare delivery system in the world is the Catholic Church, and they've got all kinds of interesting clinics and things all around Africa. But tell us more about, your experience there, what you think is going to be needed to enable these technologies. And by the way of reminder, 80% of the world's sickle cell patients are not in the US and Europe.
Right.
They are in a small number of African countries and India. So these are important markets.
The interesting thing is, I guess there's two pieces to this. One is that it's not that different to get to where it is we all want to go in Africa or India or here or South Korea. The solution is always everybody's got to win. Everybody's got to be able to get something out of it. It cannot be, this is just strictly charity. That's a different whole ball game, and that is not what this is about. So then the question is, how do you go about achieving that everybody wins scenario? And that's, I think, the real challenge for all of us, because it doesn't necessarily come the way that we think it will. So again, just two examples on that. Before I was at Creighton, I was at Georgetown Medical Center for 25 years and heard the story of how back decades ago, we had some surgeons who were engaging with the Jehovah's Witness community in the Washington, D.C. area. And of course, the challenge was that the Jehovah's Witnesses did not believe in blood transfusions. And these surgeons were becoming extremely upset about this situation until one of them kind of said, well, wait a minute. Why are we doing all these blood transfusions? Can't we do the surgery and not need this much blood? Nobody had thought of that before. But engaging with the Jehovah's Witnesses community forced them to think in a different way, right? So the second story, and we were just talking about this a little bit before, I was at a meeting at the Vatican on multi-drug resistant diseases around the world, and the WHO was there, but their role for that meeting was a bit different than their normal role. They were there to apologize. And they were apologizing for the way that they engaged in the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. And the person to whom they were apologizing was a nun who was a nurse who had been in that region for over 50 years. And when they came in, she had some suggestions for how they perhaps should go about trying to get the communities to do the best they could to limit the Ebola infestation. And they didn't listen to her because they had all the technology and they had their hazmat suits and they had their tents and they had everything. And they realized afterwards that thousands of lives were lost because they would not listen to her. Because who was she? Just some old nun who'd been in country for 50 years. So this is the part that I think we find most challenging when we're forced to do that, thinking outside the box, not in a way that we think we're going to be thinking outside the box, which I believe is what the box is all about. So, yeah.
Thank you. Jim, you've been a little modest on the cool model that you've got. Both, I'm going to get to Lisa being a little modest on something in a minute. We'll get to her in a minute. But first, on the model in Brazil, like you guys are doing some real, I know I find it interesting, I think others will find it very interesting. The idea of manufacturing down in Brazil, I think is very cool. Maybe could you just unpack your arrangement a little bit more with the Brazilian government?
Well, each of our alliances has a manufacturing component that is going to have to be regionalized. One of which is we help them build it. In the UK, they have it. But in Brazil, they have this enormous biomanufacturing capacity in Rio. It's called Fiocruz, and their model is they don't want to rely on pharma for their vaccines. There's a lot of infectious diseases in Brazil. That the way we operate is you transfer the technology, you then provide a license, we manufacture and distribute, and we pay you back. So they have more independence, and I think COVID has sort of taught us that how important that is, but they're well ahead of the curve. You know, there are 211 people in Brazil. It's a fairly large country, 650 million in Latin America. And so they have this capability, which made it a lot easier on us. So the deal is, you know, you have to invest at risk in a non-dilutive way, $100 million. You know, as a CEO of a company that's, you know, scraping around JP Morgan, getting absolutely no uptake, this was kind of helpful early on because it's an at-risk investment, so to speak. It didn't happen overnight. We've worked with them for a decade, and they actually came to us. And then we transferred the technology to to Fiocruz, which we have done. And we're in charge of global clinical development, in which we register in Brazil. And then they would manufacture, distribute, and we get economics back on that, but it's at a reduced cost. And if you look at $100 million investment relative to the cost, when the Sarepta product, Duchenne's product came out, it blew up the healthcare system. Just blew it up. They just couldn't afford it. But if you look at the savings over 10 years, it's enormous savings. But the spirit of we can do and let's do it is just unbelievable. It's just enjoy all aspects of sort of what we're doing in Brazil. Other places have sort of other agenda, but you know, I can tell you and you probably know this much better than I, but Zolgensma has been such an important model, but it's also created enormous challenges for healthcare ministers. So you go to countries where the patients demand it, as they should, and if they can't afford it, they get put in a really tough situation when patients now are no longer patient and no longer quiet.
Right.
And the amount of trouble they can cause. So I'm telling them, try to get ahead of it here. Well, let's try to be part of the solution. And I can't imagine how we do this in the United States. Mm-hmm. Just can't imagine with the way in which our payment systems are.
Yeah.
But we're not neglecting it, but that isn't part of the solution.
Yep. Great. Well,
could I just say one other thing about access? You know, as I've thought about it, India, China, and parts of Africa, you know, there are features of what we do in which you go to a place, you get your treatment, and you go home, and in which that is actually more practical than a weekly infusion of a protein. And the example, and as we think about markets and unmet need, you know, it's been unfortunately challenging with hemophilia in the United States, but a significant number of hemophiliacs are not treated in China or poorly treated. If they could get access to that, I think that this high cost sort of techie sort of thing actually could have the largest impact in those middle income countries where there could be more of a one-time intervention, because the public health system isn't supporting ASO lumbar puncture injections or infusions or even cold storage and sub-Q injections. So I think ultimately, I think we'll get there.
Sorry, great. Yeah, good. All right, Lisa, this is permission to brag a little bit, okay? Yeah. I mean, I think some people know, but many probably don't. I mean, what you started then became what is today in Zolgensma, a product that's available in more than 50 markets around the world. Bumpy fare, very bumpy at times start, but it is a really good poster child for global access. It's available in Brazil, Ecuador, Egypt, right? These are not typical markets that we see. So tell us more about that and your experience with it.
Yeah, no, thank you. And, I would say, and I agree with what all the comments up here, and, we actually tried to work with the Brazil government a lot, and there was an agreement. But to Jim's point, their current process, when they don't reimburse or have a system for it, is injunction, right? And so it does become very ugly, and completely agree. And I guess I would say, anything I'm about to say is, what worked well then, I'm not sure will be the future, right? But it does give us some, at least hope that you can find a way, right? Thinking outside the box, doing things that are creative. We were lucky in that we had the muscle of Novartis behind us as well, right? So I want to say that, I don't know that every, again, I think we have to come up with more scalable solutions for the future, and ones that, can be employed more broadly. But yeah, with regards to Zolgensma, to your question, again, when we got the US approval, the demand all around the world was extremely high. And we were trying to figure out, okay, what can we learn from what we're seeing? I mean, I had never in my entire career seen crowdfunding, private fundraising of families in, baby Pia in Belgium. And, we knew these people by name, and on the front pages of the news, and in a weekend raised $5 million through, people just donating and crowdfunding. And it was like, whoa, like this is a whole nother ball game. We have not anticipated by any means the amount of demand and what length people will go to. And, at any given time, there was probably 200 or 300 cases like that all around. And so we thought, okay, as we were gearing up for other regulatory approvals, particularly the next one up was Europe, EMA. And so we said, okay, what can we learn? And at the same time, we were also negotiating with EMA around a much broader label than we had in the US. So we thought, okay, this problem is like times 10 in the US, it's going to be like times 1,000, once we get a broader label, potentially much heavier weights, so it could be up to 6 years of age, et cetera. And so we took the approach where, we thought about, okay, typically in Europe, as we know, it takes 15 months, right, for an average product to get reimbursement. You get the regulatory, the CHMP, and then the regulatory approvals, et cetera. And so we thought, how do we work with the local governments to come up with a program that could reduce their risk up front, and basically invite them publicly to come work with us, and that we're willing to come up with all sorts of innovative schemes, outcome-based, deferral payments. I mean, there was a lot of different innovative types of designs that we were willing to work with them on. And so we decided not to wait until we had the actual regulatory approval, but we had the CHMP approval, and we issued the press release. We launched in the press release a program called the Day One program, and we invited any government around Europe, anyway, any body in Europe, to contact us, and that we'd be willing to work with them in all different ways, including, we publicly stated, deferral payment, et cetera, to ensure that their patients, where time is neurons and every day mattered, could, be enabled therapy. And right off the top, we got 16 countries contacting us. That represented 45% of the population that would be eligible. And so when you think about that, just, we put a lot of thought into the program, of course. We publicly went out. We didn't wait for the regulatory approval. We went out in advance so we could start working more proactively. And right from now, the UK was a different story, but we could enable that, and then we continued with that kind of momentum. So Europe was coming along, things we had never seen before. Even we had an NHS agreement before a NICE approval. I mean, crazy things happened, and then we had so many other countries around. We did have an agreement in Brazil. We did have. So many other countries around the world that had access to Zolgensma. Belarus, we were doing deals in Belarus. I mean, countries that you just wouldn't expect, right? Where there was not even a regulatory approval. We had contacted us, and we were working with the local governments to come up, and we had all sorts of innovative solutions that, the company, in the spirit of enabling access from day one, was willing to partake. And so I think, you know, there were a lot of lessons there. I mean, working on this way in advance, right? Of, you know, you're not just waiting for the great breakthrough science and the marketing authorization and hoping everything else will come together. In fairness, the team at Avexis, when we had acquired them, which was mainly, you know, U.S. focused, had done a lot of great work in the U.S. and then had started to think through what could be the model, you know, in Europe. And so, you know, we took that kind of, you know, philosophy and just continued. We also kept the Avexis organization completely independent from the rest of Novartis. And while over time it's been now integrated into the broader paradigm, we always had the support behind us. I do think that really made a difference. It made the governments more willing to work with us as a separate entity versus the big Novartis, right, who had other therapeutic areas to negotiate on, et cetera. And so it gave us the independence to do a lot of creative and innovative things that we weren't doing in the rest of the company, nor was the rest of the company willing to entertain, right? So there was some real lessons learned. And, you know, people always ask me, is Zolgensma, or was Zolgensma a unicorn? And I say, God, I hope not. Otherwise, what are we all doing here, right? You know, our job is to make sure that we have more Zolgensmas. Now, we may do it differently, for sure, right? And we learn from those experiences. But our job in this room and beyond is to ensure that we can bring these types of therapies, big and small, right? Big indications, small indications, to the patients who need them, and find and be open to innovative ways, turning things upside down, thinking out of the box, however we want to think about it. But yeah.
Awesome, very cool. Transformative therapy, really amazing. Okay, Lisa, I'm going to stick with you and then go to Kevin, Jim, and Matthew. So break out your collective crystal balls and think, you know, now go out 10 years. It's 2035. I'm still here, loving Mesa. You're all back, invited back on stage, and we say, hey, listen, what did you know, how is this all going to play out? What's the world going to look like? How does it evolve? Where are we in 2035? And you can give this could be the, you know, glass half full, maybe version. You can do glass half empty, just have to declare it, but not, you know, crazy Pollyannish. How about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I feel really excited. I think, you know, I'm certainly biased in the context of what we're seeing from a neuroscience perspective. And I think, you know, I don't know where Matt is, but, you know, thank you to the Unicure data that came out, right, you know, last week, or was it the week before now, you know, showing an 85% reduction. I mean, it's amazing. And I think that, you know, that level of innovation and transformation for patients should give us all hope, right? I also think, specifically as it relates to treating neurological conditions where there is so much still unmet need, again, in rare disease as well as much broader indications, there's a lot of progress that have been made in the last, I would say, certainly decade, but at least 5 years. And I think we'll see a lot more to come. The challenge is that these therapeutic areas some of them take longer to prove, right? And the Unicure data was another example of that. So I think there's a lot of hope and glimmer, and being able to treat, again, big and small neurological conditions as we go. I think the focus on delivery, whether it's direct delivery, novel capsids, or a combination of the two, is going to be where we are, at least in the next 5 to 10 years, hopefully. So I'm excited. I do think we have a lot to sort out. We can't wait to sort those out until the science pays off on how we enable access and make sure that patients who need these therapies get them. But I think there's a lot to be excited about.
Great, thank you. Kevin, crystal ball.
So my crystal ball is telling me that there are no crystal balls that are going to be able to predict what's happening 10 years from now.
You cynic.
Yeah. No, I think go back 10 years.
Yeah.
I don't remember anybody's crystal ball saying we'd be where we are now, right? So, but that in one sense is a good thing, because we don't know now what it's going to be that's going to, you know, finally help us 10 years from now. I think the key is going to be that we discovered the process for being ready for that we recognize the fact that we have to think in new ways. We have to be flexible, adaptive, engaged. We have to communicate with people around the world, get their ideas, integrate them into our own. We have to understand that we're all in this together. One of the things I can guarantee everybody here is there will be things that will go wrong. So the question is, how do we best prepare for that? And I think the best preparation we can do is to let everybody know that we are all in this together, so that when something goes wrong, they are as invested in what we're trying to accomplish as we are. So when that happens, they can say, yes, we understood that sometimes things aren't going to quite go the way that we would like them to, but that's life and we're all, invested in this. So I think that's the key part, is to make people recognize the fact that they too are part of this whole process. And again, I like your point about the one and done, right? My understanding is you can go to markets in Nairobi and you can find all the cutting edge antibiotics, anything, it's all there. But of course the people are there to buy one dose and travel a week back to where they came from. So I don't mean to freak out all the infectious disease docs in the room, but that's the world. So maybe the way we're doing things isn't the way to do them, right? Maybe the answers will be very different. I presume they will be, but my hope is that we will allow that gestation to occur and we will come up with a lot of different and new and varied ways to solve a lot of these problems.
Great, thank you. Jim,
Quick.
crystal ball.
So when I came to Penn, or Philadelphia, I met with the CEO of a pharmaceutical company in 1995 and said, if it's a drug we develop and who can't swallow it, we can't sell it. Well, okay, look at that. Genetic, personalized medicine is transformed practice of medicine. No question about it. There are no boundaries around it, as opposed to monoclonal antibodies. And the question is timing. Rare diseases, I think we will see the paradigm where rare diseases will pave the way for more common diseases. That's kind of how one justifies this. And I think we're going to see that. The problem is it takes time to have some confidence in the long-term safety as you go into more common diseases in which there are standard of care. And I think that concern over safety, which I don't think is going to play out, but a legitimate concern, is going to slow that transition. But as soon as we start seeing that kind of rare disease pave the way for more common diseases, which is, I think there'll even be more support for rare diseases.
Great, thank you. Matthew, you'll get the last word.
Thank you. That's because I'm an optimist. And
Yes.
So a couple of things I want to make a point. But it was 10 years from the signing of the global system for mobile telecommunications before it really started kicking in and making an effect. So we better get on with that. So I see a world in which there are many, many more therapeutics because there's all of these things are starting to come through. I see a world where the cost of goods has come down very dramatically. I see a world where the industry has got together and got over and solved its supply chain problems and competes on the basis of the quality of the product and the patient experience. And I see much higher uptake. For me, there's a clear route to that. The other thing, which I forgot to mention earlier on, which I want to bring in there, and it's been alluded to a couple of times already, there is at the moment this sort of a poor relationship between the industry and government in terms of the rollout of what we're doing. And one of the things that we realized at the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult, and it's not in the UK, this is, it's quite acute. We have worked on developing a novel way of evaluating the economic impact of cell and gene therapies that goes beyond the healthcare impact, goes into the macroeconomic impact. Right. And we are going to be rolling that out in 2 weeks' time. And we hope that'll be the start of a discussion where governments turn around and start to go, actually, we don't want to resist this. Mm-hmm. Right. We want to enable this. And I think then the industry will really start to fly when the industry and government are working together.
All right, not only did he get the last word, he gave us a sneak preview of something to come in 2 weeks. That's great. We've talked about this before. That's needed and important. Yeah, great. Well, please join me in thanking this group for sharing their wisdom.